Hello everybody, and welcome again to recording of me in my office here. What I wanted to do just in this brief video is to provide a little feedback to some of the common themes that came up in the discussions of the Conkin article on the discussion groups, and then also obviously connected to what many of you wrote about in the writing assignment dealing with the Conkin article and the article about the gist or gist family. I'm not sure the proper way to say that. But there were just a few things that came up repeatedly across the different groups that I wanted to take a minute to talk about in terms of hopefully clarifying how natural law would apply to some of these issues related to agriculture. And again, as I hopefully indicated in the feedback on your assignments and on the grades for the assignments and discussion boards, most of you did a really nice job of applying the concepts we've been talking about in terms of natural law and Catholic social teaching, things like that, to these specific issues. But there were just a couple of things that came up that I wanted to try to clarify. So one of the things, of course, that some of you may have noticed on the discussion boards was some questions about how does natural law apply when we are sort of intervening in what we might see as like the natural cycle of these different plants and animals, or the natural functioning of a particular ecosystem, right? So some people wondered whether or not it would be a violation of natural law to use pesticides to kill insects, or to use herbicides to kill weeds or other kinds of plants. So one thing to hopefully clarify is that for natural law, part of natural law is to see human beings as part of the natural world, so that we are not sort of this alien outside force distinct from and separated from the natural world. Human beings are part of the natural world, and for as long as there have been human beings, we have played a role in the bigger ecosystem, and so there's nothing kind of contrary to nature about that. So clearing fields, planting crops, getting rid of weeds, getting rid of pests, none of that is sort of contrary to nature. Now obviously, if we are going to get rid of pests, we ought to do it in the most humane way we can. So if we have like mice getting into our food stores, we should try to deal with them humanely, but we can protect our food stores from different kinds of pests. So that wouldn't be a violation of natural law. And again, when we're doing something like getting rid of weeds or trying to increase our harvest through increasing the fertility of a field, we ought to do it in a way that takes into consideration the good of the natural world around us. And if we are going to have to impede that in some way, we should do it in a way that causes the least harm possible. So when we're talking about using things like fertilizers or herbicides or pesticides, we might not have an option for feeding everyone that doesn't do some kind of harm to some part of the natural world, right? So then what we need to do is to choose an approach that will do the least harm possible, right? So this is a case where we would use the principle of double effect. And one of the things I would just say in regard to this module and this assignment, and then some of the upcoming modules, is that a lot of you could use double effect more when dealing with these kinds of issues, right? So if we have something that has an unintended bad effect, that's precisely the sort of situation where we should be using double effect, right? So obviously, intentionally poisoning the environment is going to be a bad thing, right? But applying a chemical to improve crop yield and production is a good act in its nature. But if it also causes these harms, then that's when we use principle of double effect to figure out if it's the right thing to do. So I would encourage you to do that, and many of you are going to run into that in your papers when you're looking at some of these same kinds of issues. We can use double effect when we are trying to provide cheap food, for example, to the poor, but it brings with it the possibility of increased obesity. Or we're trying to improve yields through GMOs, but it comes with potential health risks. So those are the kinds of situations where a double effect is going to be very useful. Step back for a second and talk about what is and what isn't violation of natural law. We've talked about the herbicides, the pesticides. Another thing that many of you looked at was things like creating hybrids, creating GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and then also a number of you commented on the use of artificial insemination in agriculture, which is where obviously you don't allow the natural mating process. It's done clinically in order to kind of maximize the benefits of a particular gene pool and produce yield that's higher and all those sorts of things, right? And again, some of you seem to conclude that this would be contrary to natural law because it's not the natural way God made for these animals to mate and to live out their lives. And again, we do want to try to allow animals to live in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary suffering, right? And to allow animals to live in a way that is in keeping with their nature. But there's not anything necessarily wrong with interventions that are very important in terms of providing food for human beings if we do it in a way that minimizes any unnecessary suffering or any suffering by the animals, right? So things like artificial insemination or selective breeding to kind of get the best possible steer or the best possible chicken, those aren't going to be wrong according to natural law. Now, if you do it in a way where you are causing suffering for the animals, which is not strictly necessary to meet the needs of people, then it could well become wrong, right? So for example, when we look at chickens, a lot of them have been bred in recent decades in such a way that they grow so big so fast that it causes really serious health problems and a lot of suffering. And I think a reasonable case could be put together that that would be contrary to natural law. We have distorted these animals' nature in a way that does cause excessive suffering. But producing the best yielding type of steer or the best yielding laying chicken isn't necessarily wrong if we are still respecting the nature of the animal as much as we can and not causing unnecessary suffering. So that was something I wanted to make sure to clarify, right? And this is a little different than a lot of you referenced the discussion from one of our readings about filling the cavity, right? Which we can do in human beings, but we wouldn't say want to change the way human beings reproduce. With animals, though, it's a little different, right? This goes back to that distinction between whos and whats, right? So animals are not whos in the sense of a human being. They aren't a person. They don't have that human dignity. So we can treat them as a means to an end. We still need to do it humanely, and we still ought to act in accord with their nature as much as we can. But we can also change them and make use of them as ways that we couldn't do with a human being, right? So the most obvious example would be it's not immoral to humanely kill and eat animals. Obviously, we can't do that with human beings, right? And by extension, we can do many other things with animals, like keep them in captivity or make use of them for food or other products or for their labor. Again, as long as we're doing that humanely and not causing unnecessary suffering. So the other thing I wanted to just mention briefly here before we leave the Conkin discussion was to talk about an issue that many of you brought up, and that was in regard to particularly the tractors and combines and some of those developments, which are very expensive and which ended up driving many people out of farming, out of the agricultural lifestyle, and ultimately led many of them to have to move and find new careers. Some of you noted that this was a definite problem with the tractors and with that development. Some of you went so far as to argue that this would make it immoral, right? That we shouldn't create machines because of the belief in the dignity of work that are going to put people out of work. And that was a good chain of thought that many of you were developing there. But again, we need to be reflective and think about how far to take that, right? Because pretty much every technological development has the potential, and many have, put people out of work, right? So we wouldn't necessarily want to go back to an economic situation where everything would have to be made by hand, right? That would cause a really radical change in our lifestyle today, right? And there are many benefits to not having to produce everything that we use by hand. So what we have to do is to try to find, again, a balance between increasing productivity, but also respecting the dignity of the workers who might be displaced by that, right? So perhaps we develop the tractors, but we also develop programs to allow for them to be more affordable to groups of small farmers, or we develop job training opportunities to allow them to go into different types of agricultural jobs or different types of farming. Because again, the other thing, some people went to the other end of the spectrum and argued, well, this is good because now they don't have to farm and they can find other jobs that are going to be less difficult and where they can earn a better salary. And again, many obviously did that. But I think it's also important to recognize that in Catholic thinking, a job is not just about a paycheck, right? That it's also a place to find meaning in life, or it's a vocation, which doesn't just refer to priests. You may have heard that before, a vocation in terms of priests or religious sisters or nuns. But in Catholic thinking more broadly, everyone hopefully has a vocation, right? That is a work in life that you are called to that has some real meaning. And for many farmers, farming is not just a job, it is a vocation. It is something that gives meaning to their lives. So to be driven out of that because of these technological developments isn't just moving from one job to another, right? That this is a more profound loss than that. And so again, I think perhaps the key way forward would be to allow for the technological developments, at least to some extent, but then also find ways to make that happen with as little loss to the dignity of the farmers as possible, and ideally a way of allowing them to benefit from it and to continue in their vocation. So you all brought up a lot of important issues, but I just wanted to address some of those things because those came up in pretty much all of the groups. If you have any questions or any further thoughts on this, feel free to just reply here in the discussion board, and we can carry on the conversation, or you could go into the Ask the Professor and ask questions there as well. Thanks for your time, and I hope this is helpful in terms of thinking through some of these issues as you prepare to write your papers.